Hello, I'm John McNutt, and this paper is on database social change techniques for social work macro, transnational, and policy practice. Contact information. I teach at the Joseph R. Biden Jr. School at the University of Delaware. Okay, so what's this about? Well, we've always used data in policy and community practice. But now there are new data sources and analysis techniques that have enriched our arsenal of social change techniques. Most of these can be incorporated into traditional practice, and a lot of the changes that have happened in society have made them more valuable. There's also the promise of new practice methodologies. Okay, so basically this is the rise of data-informed social change practice, and it's in many, many different fields. And it happens because we have new data and we have new methods, and because we have those, we can make social change practice better. So what do I mean when I say we have new data and methods? The legacy data that we always had. Things like the census, crime data, labor market data, data on program use, data on achievement. There's huge piles of it. And having said that, we're going to continue to use this data, but some of this data is having challenges now because a lot of it's based on survey research, and our success with survey research is less than it was in the past. So, 4 kinds of new data, 5 kinds of new data. Open civic data. This is data from open government. This is data that government always collected but wouldn't let you have. And now through open government legislation and government decisions, it's available. Citizen science data and crowdsourced data means getting data that's collected by citizens. Sometimes volunteers, sometimes college classes, sometimes people who are hobbyists. Amateur astronomers and amateur bird watchers have really enriched the professional scientific practice of those fields. Okay, then there's corporate data sharing. Corporations, for whatever reason, have begun to make data available that they collect for different purposes. And a lot of this data gets at things that we really have never had the ability to exploit. Okay, then there's social media data and search data. So I'm going to say something that might sound a little creepy. When you walk through a room, you leave data behind. You also leave a lot of other things behind, and we've been thinking a lot about that lately in terms of COVID-19, but you have digital traces. And those digital traces can be identified, studied, quantified, and used in some fashion to make decisions. And last but not least, we have sensor data. The biggest source of sensor data is that cell phone you have sitting in your pocket, or in your purse, or on your desk. It's gathering data about you all the time, where you are, or who you talk to. Don't get me started about Alexa. Okay, new methods and tools. Data literacy means understanding data and being able to deal with data critically. It's kind of a direct extension of things like critical thinking. It's a really useful skill to have, and we've been talking a lot more about this as one of the new liberal arts. And then there's collaboration, crowdsourcing, and co-creation. We used to sit in our offices and study things. Now we involve partners, we involve clients, we involve other people. This is a good thing. There's a new range of digital methods, things like online experiments, digital trace studies, text analysis. I can go on and on and on. This actually used to run to a second slide, but I decided that's for another presentation. And then there's the growing field of data science. Now, honestly, nobody really knows what data science is. It's kind of an evolving practice. It's different analysis and visualization techniques, most of which is done by people who have really good skills in math and stat. But we're beginning to see the involvement of other groups as well. Okay, so there are four groups that are very overlapping that are using data for social change that could move back into social work. And those four are data for good, data activism, civic tech, and data philanthropy and citizen science. So let's look at these four. Okay. Data for good is an exciting new idea. It brings the skills of professional data scientists to social problems. Now, honestly, these are expensive employees. Most nonprofits can't afford a whole lot of these folks. But when you have people who have spent a long time studying and they're making they're making out really well working for banks and marketing departments and stuff like that, but sometimes they want to do something that's more socially meaningful. The Data for Good movement gives them that opportunity. Okay, and there are basically four groups. There's volunteers and employers, because sometimes entire organizations volunteer, but at the very least you have to get permission from your boss if you want to spend 3 or 4 weeks in Africa studying the Ebola epidemic. There are placement agencies, and the one that's best known is DataGuide. Data providers, organizations that provide data, which include governments, corporations, nonprofits, range of other things. And then there's the organizations on the ground, the domain organizations, nonprofit and government agencies who are dealing with the problem. So that's kind of what you have. Okay, now employers and volunteers. A lot of the people who are volunteers work someplace, and in a lot of ways employers are willing to get them time off to work on it because it means that they can help retain them, and you have a better motivated person. And corporations do have consciousness. Some of them even have a conscience. You also have organizations that decide they want to volunteer. There are stories about organizations, for-profit organizations, that decided that their staff is going to take a week off to solve this particular problem. And it's kind of wondrous to watch in a lot of ways. Not always, but in a lot of ways. Some of the people work for universities. Some of the people in Data for Good are students. But it's kind of a big group. And then you have placement agencies, which basically work with the domain agencies to broker request. This is a time-honored tradition in social change practice, getting the right volunteers for the right place, to the right places. Then you have organizations that provide data. The organization that you're working with, Open Civic Data, Data Collaboratives, which is one of the aspects of data philanthropy, and citizen science. Last but certainly not least are the organizations on the ground that are dealing with the problem. So here are some data for good examples. Disease tracking through data and artificial intelligence, looking at disease outbreaks, pandemics, epidemics in physical and mental health, human rights abuses, genocides, mass murder, rights abuses, harassment of journalists. Because we can do text mining, we can look at millions of newspapers in the blink of an eye. Human trafficking and slavery, things that hide in plain sight, but as I said, everybody leaves a digital trail. Homelessness, something we don't always understand very well, and we can look at residential patterns, we can look at homeless careers. The homeless are hard to find, and using these techniques we can understand it better. Corruption and voter fraud, voter suppression, registration issues, all easier to look at with big data. Immigration and refugees. One of the things to consider is that we don't, and neither does any other country in the world, know how many immigrants it has. We can use trace data to identify where people live, where they came from, various and sundry other things. This is in the aggregate, not to look for specific people. Clean air and water are a worldwide problem. You wouldn't think so, but they are. We can study who has access to clean water and who doesn't. And finally, violence, war, and hate. These are all things that we can study, we can predict, and eventually we can prevent. Okay, data activism is one of the current outgrowths of media activism. Media activism used to be like movement reporters and people who did alternative media. That was back when media was harder to do than it is today. Now pretty much everybody can produce their own videos. I won't say they're all good, but anybody can do that. Data activism is the next step, and there are groups of people who work on data and social movement. They're called data activists. Civic technology is a little different. This brings volunteers together with nonprofits, with local citizens, with local government to solve civic problems that are created in government and solved with technology. So this is kind of cool. Civic technology brings together people who understand technology in an effort to improve government. It's basically three parts. It uses open data. Without data, this doesn't work. It uses different kinds of technology. I guess the key is it also uses practices. And the practices include things like Code for America fellowships. This is where Code for America got a volunteer technologist to work in government to create some kind of intervention that solved a government problem. Brigades are groups of volunteer technologists, and they get together and they solve problems for local governments. One of the things to consider is that good technology and good technology people are often out of government reach. they can't afford them, or they can't hire them. So a lot of government technology isn't as good as it could be. But if you can bring somebody who has those skills, then you can make a change. One of the other practices is hackathons. These are kind of contests where organizations bring problems that they have, and people compete to come up with technology that changes those, that makes it better. These are all exciting things, and they can, in a lot of ways, reinvent government from the outside. Okay, data philanthropy and citizen science. Okay, data philanthropy is when mostly commercial organizations make their data available to social change causes, generally through either their own offices or through data collaboratives. Data collaboratives work to make the bridge between organizations that need the data and organizations that have the data. Corporate America knows a lot of things. They have a lot of data. Okay, like Uber has really rich transportation data. I mean, up until about 10 or 15 years ago, we had really crappy ways of figuring out where people went. We gave them diaries. We had people sit in cars and count cars. We had those little bumps in the road that would record how many cars went by, but didn't really give us very rich data to make planning on. Well, this does. When you put your stuff in LinkedIn, it provides LinkedIn with incredibly good data on what the labor market is doing. When you complain on Yelp that basically you almost died and went to heaven after you ate at such and such a restaurant, well, when 30 other people do it, Yelp lets the health department know, and they can go out and do an impromptu inspection. There's so much data that's available, and so much of it is exciting and new, that this is a fantastic source. Then there's citizen science and crowdsourcing. This is involving citizens. We have amateur astronomers. We also have professional astronomers. Through citizen science, they work together. Computers aren't good for everything, and sometimes it's really hard to look at a lot of different kinds of data. So basically what I'm saying is that these groups can provide certain things that were too expensive if professional scientists did them. And while there's certainly some issues, these kinds of findings can be very useful. So what are the commonalities? Well, the commonalities are that volunteerism and co-creation, which I consider volunteerism but probably isn't, people working together for the common good through technology and new data. And what this basically results in is citizen power. So that's a good thing. So what should social work do with it? Okay, so here's what I think in broad brush. That every social worker needs to be data literate. That you need to understand not only what data says on its face, but how it was collected, what are the issues and how it was analyzed, and how it should be applied. I mean, there are lots and lots of hugely wonderful research programs that you hear about on the news, and then you look at the actual paper, and they only did it for 10 people, and they didn't do a random sample, or they didn't use randomization, and basically it's data you shouldn't be. It is evidence, it's just not very good evidence. Okay, there needs to be more of a data specialist, somebody who can use data science findings and can employ them in traditional social work practice. And then finally, I'm not saying every social worker should become a data scientist, but some of them should. And can. Okay, so let's look at some applications to community practice. This up the way that Jack Rothman did years and years ago. Social action, data activism, data and social movements. This is a big group in Europe. It's a growing group in the United States. Data and planning. Planning has always been data heavy, but the kind of data that we have now really can make some of the planning interventions sing. And then there's data to get people to work together through things like civic tech. So there are exciting ways that we can build this into data-informed practice. Okay, policy practice. I'm depressed. I couldn't get that thing in there. What that sign says is 2 things too easy to buy, and of course it has a rifle in Congress there. Okay, policy analysis has always been data enhanced, but it's mostly been administrative data or data from things like the census. We can nuance our data analysis a lot better with these new data sources, these new techniques. Policy analysis done by opposition groups is one of the principal ways that data for good is used. Okay, then policy advocacy, my personal favorite. Data science tools to look at constituents to see what they want, to support informational lobbying, to look at targets of opportunity for advocacy efforts. All those things are good things. And to be honest, a lot of professional advocacy groups in the corporate sector are already using all this. We should be too. So for policy evaluation, data science, and evidence-based policy, we can do things that we couldn't do 20 years ago. And we should. From a transnational social work perspective, I broke this up kind of into, and this is by no means exhaustive, domestic-based practice, where you advocate for people who are either here or people in other countries that are getting dealt with by the United States. For example, people who lobby for foreign aid and international assistance. Then there are more internationally based practice, crimes and corruption, human trafficking, human rights abuses. There's a lot of this in the world, and a lot of it hides in plain sight. Okay, a lot of the data for good stuff is international. There are some fantastic opportunities. Okay, so what does this mean for practice? There are new capacities that are within our reach. We already have many of the skills. These are exciting new tools and exciting data. And let's change the world. We'll start today. Okay, if this was one of my face-to-face presentations, I'd make everybody step up and repeat. Now is the time. This is the place. We are the people. Let us begin. Thanks so much. Let's all go out and do something.